Hello and welcome to the EPRS Chronicles. In this two-part series, we will look at the change in the EU institutional cycle. For this, I am joined by EPRS resident expert in the European Council, Ralph Drakenberg. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, Kelly.
So let's start, before we delve into details, by talking a little bit about what moment in the cycle we are currently in.
Yes, Kelly, we are actually at the end of an institutional cycle, looking forward to the beginning of a new one. And I always compare this moment, the EU, with a computer, where we actually have to, every 5 years, update the hardware, which I see the EU institutions and its leaders, and its softwares, which is the political priorities.
Fantastic. And let's talk in this episode more about the political priorities. Can you tell us what role the European Council plays in updating this software?
Maybe at the outside, we should just briefly focus on the European Council, because there's still a lot of confusion going around what is actually meant by this. And that's actually normally because there's so many councils around. We at least have 2 EU institutions which have the name council in it. We have the Council of the European Union, which is ministers, and we have the European Council, which is the European heads of states of government. And the other difference between those 2 EU institutions is their role. The Council of Ministers does legislation together with the European Parliament, while the European Council is forbidden to do legislation, and their role is actually to set the political priorities and do the strategic guidance.
Okay, well, thank you for clarifying that, Ralph. So let's stick with the heads of state and government and talk about how they play a role in setting the political priorities.
It's quite important to know where you can find the political priorities, because the European Council adopts the political priorities in a document called its strategic agenda, which is adopted every 5 years. It's a long-term political priorities. And there's also a second document which the Commission adopts, which the Commission adopts afterwards. And of course, it takes inspiration of the strategic agenda of the European Council.
In the strategic agenda of the European Council, can you tell us what the current priorities are?
Yes, of course, Kelly. There are currently 4 priorities. First of all, we have something called protecting citizens. Then we have developing a strong economic base. Then we have building a climate neutral, fair, green and social Europe. And we have protecting European interests and values in the world.
And over the last 2 institutional cycles, so the last 2 5-year periods, have we seen shifts in political priorities?
Yes, because our priorities, of course, have to adapt with the circumstances we're living in. However, what's interesting to see is that sometimes the same concepts become a different meaning. And the example would be protecting citizens. Currently, it's supposed to focus on fighting terrorism and addressing migration. In the past, protecting citizens meant looking at unemployment, pensions, and social benefits. A similar change in the meaning or the content of policy priority is migration. In the last strategic agenda, we had migration also, but there we had the element also of legal migration. This element is completely gone in this strategic agenda.
Oh, thank you. That's a very important clarification. Let me ask you this. When political priorities change, how do institutions adapt and adjust? Do they?
Yes, as I said, it's important to consider long-term political priorities is the strategic agenda. And when this document is developed, you do not foresee a crisis. Nobody knew that a migration crisis would happen or the COVID crisis. And so those elements were not as strong in the strategic agendas than they were important to fight with the crisis. So what the European Council does after each formal meeting is to adopt conclusions. And in these conclusions, they either further detail existing priorities or they add new ones in order to face those challenges.
All right, very clear. So now that we're heading into the 2024-2029 European cycle, as it were, is the European Council already thinking about what their new political priorities will be?
Yes, they are, Kelly. Actually, the President of the European Council started already last June, sending a letter to all of his colleagues in the European Council, starting this reflection process on the next political priorities. This is actually quite early, because the last time around in 2019, they came up with those discussions only about 2 months before the final document was adopted. So the process now foresees that a number of members of the European Council, normally 4 to 5, meet with the European Council President and debate individual individual topics which are important for the future of Europe. Then they all convene at formal European Council meetings where they exchange their views. And an important meeting will be the special European Council in April, where they will discuss first drafts for the next priorities, and the new strategic agenda will be adopted at the end of June this year.
Thank you very much, Ralph. This concludes our first episode on EU institutional cycles, in which we learned about how instrumental the European Council is in setting political priorities, the software of the European Union. Join us for our next episode, in which we will look at the hardware, i.e. the institutions and leaders, how they are selected for the next EU institutional cycle.